Hey, Doug, good afternoon, and thank you for joining the conversation here today with Safe Security. I'll straight away jump into the topic of our conversation, Doug, which is all about cyber risk management. So, Doug, you are a pioneer in the field of overall risk management, and one of your best-selling books among many is How to Measure Anything and Everything in Cybersecurity Risk. Tell us about your core thesis for our audience around cyber security risk management.
Sure. And thanks for having me, Pankaj. The main idea is that everything in cybersecurity, like everywhere else, is measurable. My first book was called How to Measure Anything, and this book was really a spin-off of that. So, and I meant it literally. How to Measure Anything, Finding the Value of Intangibles in Business was the first book. So I've written 4. This was my 4th book, the How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. I kept on running into cybersecurity specialists who would say something I've heard actually in many fields, that their field was uniquely complex and uniquely difficult to measure, more so than every other field, more so than pharmacologists, environmental policy, intellectual development of children, military logistics, prioritizing investments in the developing world. In all of these areas, different individuals would say their area was the most complex and the most difficult to measure. Well, they say that simply because they're unfamiliar with all the other fields. So a lot of people don't have the good fortune of seeing how different people think in very different fields, right? So I had the luxury of being a mile wide and an inch deep in many different topics. So I see, why does everyone feel they're the most complicated? They're the most difficult to measure. And of course, cybersecurity is right up there. They say that quite a lot. But I didn't see anything that was unique in cybersecurity. There's rapidly changing technology. Yeah, that fits with a lot of fields. They have intelligent adversaries. Military doesn't have that. Just insurance against theft doesn't have that. Yeah, there's intelligent adversaries in lots of areas. So yes, people routinely deal with that. I think one of the issues though is, and this is a really important idea, is that no matter how complex a problem seems to be, doing it entirely intuitively doesn't alleviate any of those issues. If we're counting on our expert intuition or soft qualitative scoring methods, and we're hoping that that will alleviate the lack of data or rapidly changing technology or complex behavior of adversaries. Well, it doesn't. It simply glosses over it. So another key idea, in addition to everything that we thought was immeasurable really is measurable, another key idea is that all we're trying to do is choose the better performing decision model. No matter how we're doing it, we're choosing a model. Even our unaided intuition is a model. So the question is, which model measurably outperforms the other? Because we also don't have a choice not to model. We're modeling it anyway. If we're counting our intuition as a model, well, then we're always modeling. So we're always modeling, and the only question is which model is measurably less wrong. This is a key point too. A model doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be better than the alternative models. And it's pretty easy to show in a wide variety of research topics, actually, that intuition is easily outperformed by algorithms in a variety of fields. Cancer patient oncology, criminal recidivism, how well new movies will do, etc. Those are several areas where it seems like the decisions are very complex. And yet the research is showing that simple statistical models are outperforming human experts. So regardless of the measurement challenge, whether they're talking about reputation, well, outside of cybersecurity, certainly that has observable consequences. If somebody says our reputation was damaged, I would say, what do you see when you see more damage to reputation? They end up identifying observable consequences. Once you've figured out how you observe something, you're halfway to measuring it. The rest is trivial math.
Great, Doug. It's interesting. Most or almost all the practitioners in cybersecurity, as well as the leaders in cybersecurity, they come from technology. They come from mathematical background, And at the same time, when we talk to them or propose to them, think about probabilities and think about risk management, it's a difficult concept for them to grasp. How should cybersecurity practitioners think about probabilities, mathematical modeling, and risk management to make their jobs better?
Sure. You know, we did a survey as part of the research for that How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk book. And we were asking the question, is there any relationship between preferences and attitudes towards quantitative methods and literacy in quantitative methods? And not surprisingly, we found out that people that scored high in statistical literacy, they would do well on a quiz, were also more accepting of quantitative methods. That is not too surprising. And people who scored poorly on statistical literacy were more resistant to the adoption of quantitative methods. What I found was interesting, though, is that the statistical literacy section of the survey was a set of multiple choice questions. And the last answer on all of the questions was, I don't know. So someone could have chosen, I don't know, on each one of them. What we observed is that people who chose, I don't know, a lot weren't necessarily more resistant to the adoption of quantitative methods. It was the people who thought they did know and were wrong. So there's a quote that's sometimes misattributed to Mark Twain that says, it's not what you don't know that will hurt you, it's what you know that ain't so. I think there's things that have to be unlearned about probabilities in cybersecurity. I'm constantly running into this. Even just this week, I would have these conversations about how do we think about probabilities and statistics in cybersecurity. There are some profound misconceptions out there. And in addition to learning a little bit more about how to think about probabilities, we really have to unlearn some stuff. I learned a new term this last year as I was doing research for the second edition of that fourth book, because I'm working on the second edition now. The term came from an academic researcher. He referred to this as refutational instruction. Refutational instruction is the idea that the instructor, the professor, should not assume that the students will simply dispose of any misconceptions when they learn the new material. That's not a good bet. What they should assume is they directly have to address those misconceptions early. Because what really happens is if you're sitting through a stats course and you're eventually going to be a cybersecurity expert, when you're sitting through a stats course, you don't really dispose of your prior misconceptions, or you might not dispose of them. In fact, what you do is as you learn new things, you might figure out how to incorporate your previous misconceptions into new things that you learn. So for example, there's a lot of people in cybersecurity who would say, yes, they've heard of the phrase statistically significant sample size. Now, there is no such thing. There's no such thing as a statistically significant sample size. There is statistical significance, that's a thing. And there is a sample size, that's a thing. But there's no universal number where if you're one short of it, you can't make an inference. So often in cybersecurity, they have this impression that they need some large amount of data to make any inferences at all. And they say, we don't have enough data to measure that. This seems to happen a lot in cybersecurity. We'd like to measure that, but we don't have enough data. Well, you have more data than you think, and you need less than you think to inform decisions. When you look at the actual math, there's no threshold where if I don't get at least this many samples or at least this many observations, I can't say anything about it at all. The way the math works is every single observation. In fact, every month that ticks by where you don't see a ransomware attack tells you something about the likelihood of a ransomware attack. Just the fact that you haven't observed one yet tells you something about it. If you've gone on 8 years and haven't observed a major data breach, let's say of some sort, does that tell me anything about the chance of observing one next year? Well, the math says yes. When you look at these Bayesian methods I talk about a lot of Bayesian methods in the book. So the statistical methods, the probabilistic methods we use for updating our prior uncertainties given new information. So cybersecurity experts should think about probabilities that way. They should think about probabilities as a statement of my current state of uncertainty. I think something's 20% likely. And if I looked at all of the times I thought something was 20% likely, did it occur about 20% of the time? So for example, if I ask for a large number of predictions from a cybersecurity expert, and they go down and say, this is 10% likely, that's 40% likely, this is 5% likely. And they do it for such a large number that at the end of the year, we'll know whether or not some large number of these things resolve, because we were asking them for probabilities that this would happen this year. Okay, so let's say there was 100 instances where they thought something was 20% likely to occur by the end of the year. Well, by the end of the year, we should see that about 20 of them occurred. So we can get some feedback on that. So you can calibrate people, you can train people to be very good at subjectively assessing uncertainty. Once you adopt the idea that a probability, one way of interpreting probability, by the way, there's some discussion about this among statisticians. It's been a debate for many decades, actually. How do we think about probability? Well, one mathematically consistent way to think about probability is it's a statement of the current state of uncertainty of the observer. So the cybersecurity expert is expressing their uncertainty when they say that's 20% likely or 5% likely. And when it comes to assessing your own uncertainty, you're the world's leading expert. No one else knows more about your uncertainty than you do. All you need to do is to be trained at being good at it. And a lot of our research shows that people can be trained to be pretty good at quantifying uncertainty. In other words, we can train them to be well calibrated. If we looked at all the times they said they were 80% confident, they would have been right about 80% of the time. All the times they said something was 10% likely, it happened about 10% of the time over a large number of trials. So this appears to be a skill that people can learn, and it takes about half a day for most people.
All right, Doug. And you talk to many chief information security officers or security experts. We have also talked to many. And one of the feedback that, or one of the discussion points there always is, that's all good. I understand the concept mathematically. How do I use it in the business context? How do I use a risk quantification or cyber risk quantification specifically to do my job better, to communicate my job better, or to talk to my teams better? What is your view on that?
Yeah, I think you have to use, well, you do have to use quantitative methods to work out a very important metric, return on control. So if I can quantify risk and monetize it, that means I can monetize risk reduction. And there's lots of ways to monetize this. I was just talking to a whole bunch of reinsurance people earlier today. They're used to monetizing risk in other kinds of contexts, but their cybersecurity people were not. Their actuaries are, but the cybersecurity people are not used to that sort of context. Yes, you can quantify risk and monetize risk. That's the way insurance works. You monetize it. And if you can monetize risk, that means you can monetize risk reduction. And if you can monetize risk reduction and compare that to the cost of a control, then you can compute the return on control. Now, there's a few different ways to do this, but simply computing the return on control is a very important metric for the CISO. That's the best way for them to prioritize a large number of possible controls. They probably have more possible controls than they have resources to implement. There's lots of risks. They can't really control them all. They have a limited budget. So how do they prioritize what they need to control? Well, the return on control is the best way to do it. Simply sort alternative controls by their return on control. Do the highest return ones first and go down the list until you run out of money. So
Doug, we'd love to double click on the concept of return on controls, ROC. How does one think about the return? So I know that if I have to act on a particular control, I might need investments of people or dollars or time. What is the measurable return on the other side of the equation that you believe in or you've seen practitioners follow?
Well, that really comes down to kind of a standard business case or cash flow or net present value kind of an argument. In a very simple way, you might just say, well, here's the period of time over which I will expect to receive this benefit. So I'm reducing risk from what it otherwise would have been without these controls. And maybe I look at a 3-year period. And I'm saying, well, I'm reducing risk by $1 million a year for a 3-year period. And this control is only $500,000. So I say, well, 3 million divided by $500,000, and I'm going to subtract 1 for that, because generally we think of a 0% return, meaning the benefits exactly equal the cost. And so 100% return is that you get twice the benefits back. Now that glosses over a couple of issues like time value of money and so forth, but really you're probably looking at a short enough time period that things like discount rates and time value of money probably doesn't make that big a difference. So it's useful to keep it simple. There's other ways to compute this. You can compute internal rate of return and things like this. That has its own issues. But if we keep it simple, usually you're going to get the optimal answer just with this simplest approach, the return on control. So you've got the benefits are just the risk reduction. So you said there's a 10% chance of this per year, and if this event occurred, I would lose somewhere between $4 million and $40 million. So I take the mean of the $4 million to $40 million, I take it times 10%, and that's my monetized risk. I implement a control that I think will reduce the risk by, let's say, 75%. That's a dollar amount that I'll get. That's 75% of that original risk, all right? That's the benefit, and that's the per year benefit. If I say that there's a 10% chance per year of this occurring, that's a per year benefit if I bring this risk down.
Great, Doug. And I want to extend this business context discussion to other C-suite or other CXOs. If you talk about CEOs or CFOs and even board members, we'll come to board members in a minute. For CEOs and CFOs, why is cyber risk quantification important? How can cyber risk quantification help not just the CISOs, but also the CEOs and the CFOs to manage enterprise risk overall?
Yeah, that's a good question, because often if a CISO or somebody in cybersecurity is presenting to a CFO or sometimes maybe a CEO, and they say, I need this much money, I need $50 million or $150 million, whatever it is, to mitigate these risks, the CFO or CEO might ask the question, well, how do I know how good an investment this is? And you say, well, we're moving 3 reds down to 3 yellows, and we've got 7 yellows we turn into greens. Well, that doesn't tell me anything, right? Or I said that my risk is a medium or something like this. That doesn't mean anything to the CFO. If we can quantify and then monetize risk, we're speaking the CFO's language. The CFO will actually be more familiar with some of these quantification methods than the CISO might be. The CFO studied things like modern portfolio theory and quantitative finance and things like this. They might actually remember some of this. There's a standard tool that comes up quite a lot in financial risk and also actuarial risk and even nuclear power plants. It's called the loss exceedance curve. The loss exceedance curve represents the probability of losing more than X amount in a given year. So there's this curve, which is kind of downward sloping, starts high on the left and slopes down to the right. And it might say there's a 30% chance of losing more than $1 million, and a 10% chance of losing more than 5 million, and a 1% chance of losing more than 20 million. Those would just be points on that curve. Well, I recall presenting this to a board of directors, to a decent size health insurance company, a group health insurance company here in the Chicago area. I can mention their name because they let me write a case example in the book. It's called Trustmark Insurance. And one of the directors at the board of directors level, when I showed them their loss exceedance curve and their loss exceedance tolerance curve, and I could show that the loss exceedance curve was underneath their tolerance curve, meaning that they had an acceptable amount of risk, he said, how come no one's ever shown it to me like this before? He wasn't lamenting the fact that we were being quantitative or too complicated. He was saying, how come you haven't always been shown it like this? He didn't know that you could show it like that. He thought that because he'd been told all these years that cybersecurity is different, you can't apply the same financial rules. No, you should be able to apply the same financial thinking. You're going to spend some money and you're hoping that the benefits exceed the cost of the things that you're getting. That's a fundamental concept. CFOs get that just fine. They study things like options theory and so forth. They covered the whole idea of probabilities of various levels of losses or value at risk. They understand these concepts. One of the things I think I hear quite a lot in cybersecurity and a few different areas of management and middle management is that I'll hear a warning from middle management or somebody in cybersecurity that I should be careful how quantitative or detailed I get presenting economic financial methods to upper management, because they tell me they're not going to understand it. I've never seen that happen yet. They always understand it. I think it's the cybersecurity people that don't understand it. I think they're concerned that, well, I tried to present some financial analysis in the past and they didn't seem to get it. Actually, you know what? I think they did get it. And they didn't like it because it wasn't very good. So yes, the CFO, I agree with. I would agree with the CFO when the CFO says, that's meaningless to me. I don't know what your analysis means. And he says that to the CISO or somebody. I'm agreeing with the CFO. I think the CFO understands perfectly well that the CISO is putting together some nonsense that they shouldn't necessarily believe, okay? When I go and speak to that same group and we're doing proper quantitative methods, they understand just fine. And I get all these fascinating questions that indicate that they really do understand. They dive right into it. They say, well, how do I know I have all of these factors? And how do I know that, are we accounting for correlations between events and things? These are all valid questions, which you can model once you've adopted quantitative methods. You can certainly keep modeling those things. Yes.
Talking about the board members, Doug, then I want to pick up on that thread. Recently, regulators across the world, including SEC, they are moving in the direction where cyber risk security, cyber risk management is or has already become a boardroom topic. In this scenario, when board members will have to come up with their judgment on cyber risk management policies or cyber risk management practices, will have to evaluate and make sure that the management is protecting the shareholders' value. What is your guidance to board members? What do you think, how should a board member think about understanding, assessing, asking the right questions about cyber risk management?
Yeah, I looked at the SEC proposed regulations, the proposed guidance on SEC there, and it kind of reminded me of a lot of other regulations, actually. They don't really tell you how to do it. They say you should have somebody do this. They should have somebody on the board of directors that does X, Y, and Z. But how you do it makes all the difference in the world. There are some highly ineffectual methods that are nonsense, and there are methods that really do improve decisions. And unfortunately, regulatory bodies don't seem to be able to discriminate among those. So they just say, look, you have to have a CISO on the board of directors. You have to have a cybersecurity person represented at the board of directors level. Okay, but how are they actually doing cybersecurity? How are they doing cybersecurity risk assessment? How are they figuring out where to allocate limited resources? This is a pretty important point. I think it was Dodd-Frank, this is a previous regulation from the financial crisis. Dodd-Frank looked into how they should better regulate financial institutions. In this case, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. And they actually said right in the regulation that you shall use a risk matrix. It's by law, they have to use a risk matrix. Now, all of the research says that they either don't improve decisions or they make them worse. There has never been a single study of the use of those that indicated that decisions got any better at all. And yet that's codified in law. So I'm always concerned about that. I suppose in some ways regulation can elevate the visibility of a topic by saying you should do X, Y, and Z, but they don't really say anything about, well, there are some better methods than other methods. And maybe we should have a way of discriminating among methods that work and ones that don't work. The private sector is actually picking up on part of that, by the way. My co-author on the fourth book, Richard Searson, he's the chief risk officer for an insurance company. It's called Resilience. and they're taking a novel approach to underwriting cybersecurity risk. So they underwrite cybersecurity risk. And the novel approach they take is that they're going to look at how people assess risk and how they control risk. This is new to cybersecurity risk underwriting. They didn't do that before. Generally, cybersecurity insurance was sort of like general liability. They would just say, for $1 million of coverage, it's going to cost you $60,000 a year or something like this. And they didn't really do any underwriting. But now they're thinking that they can do better risk selection with better underwriting. So the private market, the free market is actually picking up on a couple of these things. I think that's a good move. I think it's important for more people to adopt more quantitative methods, and they'll find that they actually get better insurance if they're going to adopt better methods. You can get lower rates, right? It's just sort of like, if you had a good driving record in the past, you get lower rates, right? And if you don't have a good driving record, even if you've never had an accident, but you got a lot of speeding tickets, so you got a lot of violations, a lot of fines, even though you haven't had an accident, your insurance rates will be higher. And I think that kind of applies to cybersecurity. Even though you haven't had a major data breach, are they violating basic good practices about how to run cybersecurity? Maybe that's the way we should think about these things. So I think it's really important to put these in a financial context for the CFO. The CFO and the CEO always get it when you put it in a financial context. What they don't get is the red, yellow, green, high, medium, low kind of stuff. They get the financial return. So really all the CISO needs to do is translate their proposals into their language. They need to translate the cybersecurity request for funds into the language of the rest of the organization.